If you've been around headphones for any length of time, you've probably heard about the Harman target. It's a target that was developed over a series of years. There's a lot of papers and research and studies put into this target. The research that's been put into it is a lot more than people realize. And some people assume that it's just like an average target for people who don't really know what they want, but it was actually based on a lot of research, understanding acoustics, how speakers react when they're in a room, and it's become really valuable to the entire industry. The problem is that it's only really compatible with measurement rigs of a specific type, mainly grass systems that are using a KB5000 pinna. This means that the Harman target isn't really applicable to other measurement systems, such as ones by Head Acoustics or B&K, which is kind of a problem as both B&K and Head Acoustics are pioneering a new measurement standard, which means they are becoming more popular in the industry. This is a good thing because they are more accurate and it's nice to see improvements. But the problem is that the Harman target itself doesn't really apply to them anymore. But that doesn't mean that the Harman research can't be used. So what a few are doing is trying to develop a way to still use the Harman research, but develop a new target that works with these new systems. One way that is being proposed is to use diffuse field and modify that to a form of the Harman target. Now, what diffuse field is it's the response of sounds coming all around you. Some say this represents a measurement in a fully reflective room, but it can also be achieved by measuring in an anechoic chamber with a head and torso simulator, and then measuring from different positions around the hats and combining it to result in the final diffuse field curve. The nice thing about using diffuse field is you're able to capture the head-related transfer function. In short, this is how your ears shape the sound by the time it reaches your eardrum. When we hear, we don't hear every frequency the same. Certain frequencies are increased or decreased depending on each person and how their ear is shaped. This is also applicable to measurement systems. Since measurement systems have their own ears, they also need to account for their own transfer function. That's why you can't compare raw measurements from, say, a Gras Kimar to a B&K 5128, which is why this is being proposed. By measuring with diffuse field, for each measurement system, you can capture the same conditions and then capture the transfer function of how each measurement system measures that exact same situation. From that, you can develop a baseline for a target that can be constructed for any system using diffuse field. So how do we turn a diffuse field target into a Harman-like target? The Harman research showed that speakers in a normal room tend to have a downward tilt compared to being completely flat. And this was also what they found was a preference for both speakers and headphones. Now applying this to headphone measurements, let's look at my measurement of the HD600 next to the Harman target. Now the first thing to note is my measurement comes from a clone of the Gras 43AG, although the pinna is more similar to the old Gras Kimar pinna, so it doesn't quite align with measurements that you get on a KB5000 pinna. So as you can see, there is quite a bit more deviation here than you might see from measurements like critical or oratory, but we can still use this to demonstrate what I'm talking about. So here I have overlaid the Harman target, the HD600. Now this is the diffuse field head-related transfer function for the Gras Kimar. And as you can see from this, it's not really what most people would prefer. It has a bit too much upper mids and treble, and then the low end rolls off quite a bit. So this is something that the general listener would consider as sounding thin and bright. But looking at this, if we flatten the target so that the diffuse field is flat, you see that the Harman target has sort of a downward slope to it, and this aligns with the research from Harman. So knowing that diffuse field is an objective measurement in specific conditions and can be replicated on any system, instead of trying to develop a new Harman target for every rig, some are proposing to simply tilt diffuse field down to match the Harman research. So instead of having the Harman target there, you could tilt down diffuse field and you get a straight line that contains the transfer function from the diffuse field target. If you then take it and make it look raw again, you see it has a lot more of the Harman sort of look to it. Now if you hide the diffuse field and bring back the Harman, you can see that there is a little bit of deviation up here, Now remember that this measurement with the diffuse field still has the transfer function from the KEMAR measurement, so it has the information of the peaks and dips that naturally come from this specific ear. Now looking at this, it does look quite similar, although you'll notice it doesn't have the same bass response that the Harman target did. But if the ones making this target wanted to add in a bass shelf, they always could. So if you just add in a little bass shelf, then it becomes very similar to the Harman target, but it has the transfer function information in it. Now I'm doing this using the diffuse field from the KEMAR and sort of applying it to my rig, which is a knockoff of it. But the reason that this is important and actually could be really beneficial is that this can be applied to any measurement system. So it's not just about moving to the B&K 5128, but also the new Super HMS, as well as maybe something in the future that Grass might put out. And this can also be backwards compatible as well. Now from this, there's also the argument to start looking at measurements more often in a compensated manner, which I'm sure is going to be quite controversial. There's a lot of idea that using compensated measurements is just what you use if you don't really understand how to read raw measurements, but there's actually a couple of reasons why it might be better to start using compensated more. First of all, for compatibility between different rigs, you won't have to learn how to read a different raw measurement every time. If you compensate them all, we can get used to looking at them as a version of the fuse field with a down tilt. And if we know that each rig is going to be using that, then it'll be easier to compare across different systems. Obviously they're not going to be the same because different measurement systems measure differently, but in the terms of how we read them, it'll be easier to compare. Another reason why compensated measurements might start to be used more is because of the curved and parallel line illusion. When it comes to comparing lines, it's actually a little bit harder to compare curved parallel lines than we think. But if we are looking at them in more of a flat sort of manner, it's easier to see the deviation from both the target and from each other, compared to looking at raw graphs with different curves and having to memorize what rig measures a certain way. So yeah, I was maybe just trying to clear up a little bit about what's going on with the headphone community and how certain reviewers are moving away from the Harman target specifically, but they're not really moving away from the Harman research, and more are sort of developing a Harman-like target for any system that they use.